Right.
What's up? Okay, great. So welcome everybody in the room, and everybody online. Looks like we've got about 68 people online and quite a few in the room. We have seating for, I think, 60 in here. Obviously a little bit less than that, but really appreciate everybody coming out, especially considering the weather, right? A little bit of lake effect snow that was not supposed to come until tonight, I believe. So we really appreciate, we've got some panelists here to talk about housing, and they've traveled from afar, so we're really fortunate to have them here. So I'll give a little bit of background as to why we're all here. The town of Dorset has been reviewing options for a possible housing project at Raptor Lane to support the community. The whole process at this point has been slowed down to involve the public. And in doing that, we fashioned a couple of what we're calling input sessions. There's a lot of material. When you get into housing, you get into the market and all kinds of other aspects of it, and there's a lot of material. So what we've done is we've structured, planned for 2 meetings, one obviously tonight, the next one would be February 18th. The meeting structure is such that tonight we're going to talk about a presentation on the discussion and need for housing, which is going to include some reports from panelists here about demographics, trends, both in the housing market, population, both at the county level, town level, state level, a little bit about what's going on across the state as a whole. And hopefully then having some time for some discussion and some feedback. I think when we started this journey, we have a problem, right? A perceived problem with housing and access to housing. Dorset's got a unique opportunity where we have an asset, Raptor Lane, there's a possible solution there toward that problem. And now you're seeing us kind of work through the process to figure out how do we solve that problem in a way that makes sense for our community. So without kind of further blabbering on, that's kind of the goals for tonight, is to get through some of this data. We've got Kevin Chu from the Vermont Futures Project, who's here to talk about just demographic trends and some of the regional housing data with a focus on our Dorset area. We've got Moreau Weinberger from Let's Build Homes. And he's going to help present a little bit of info about the policies Vermont has adopted recently to address housing and the need for housing. And then after that, we're going to get into hopefully a full depth public discussion about housing, the need for housing, why, and all that good stuff. Trying to get through this as reasonably efficiently but thoroughly as we can, given that everybody's out here on a cold, snowy night. And we'll try to, close up at about a 90-minute mark, hopefully. That's kind of the general goal. If folks want to stay longer, we can, I guess, get there when we get there. So with that said, I'm going to let more people in, and we will kind of pass it off to Kevin, who's got some prepared info that he can present to us.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. I'm going to share my screen here and then open up a slide deck. But before we get into the data and talking about population and demographics, I'm meeting many of you for the first time. And I think when we have discussions about housing, it's important to remember that it's really about people and community. So who am I? Who is this guy sitting at the front of the room? I am the son of immigrant parents. My parents moved to the state of Vermont in 1986. And you're probably wondering, how did they choose Vermont of all places? They came here when it was snowy and cold too. Moved from Southeast China because I have one aunt who married an American and they happen to have a home in the state of Vermont. That was the only social connection that my parents had to the entire country. So I feel lucky to call myself a Vermonter. I feel lucky that my parents were able to find housing. They were able to find economic opportunity, built a life here, raised 3 boys, put them through college, and they were able to find their American dream and make it work. Lots of hard work and sacrifice to realize that dream, but it was possible. So I share that because the work that I do with the Vermont Futures Project is really about this idea of opportunity, not only now, but how do we make sure that's part of Vermont's story moving forward into the future as well. So you'll see here on the screen the mission question that the Futures Project tries to answer through our work. Our most recent answer to this question is the development of an economic action plan. This was published about a year ago now, and I brought some extra copies in case you want to learn more about it. I'll put them at the front table later tonight. But I'll just say some brief remarks about what's in this plan because it sets the context for the discussion that we'll have tonight. And we'll take a look at some localized data, but I think it's important to have that broader context as well. So this plan is meant to put Vermont on a path towards affordability and abundance. I'll get into what that means, but first I'll say that it was built through forums like this, through public engagement and quantitative data analysis, right? So we brought the quantitative and qualitative together. I traveled around the state to all 14 counties, spoke with over 5,000 Vermonters to develop this plan over the course of a couple of years. This is a small sample of some of the key themes that emerged. Things like affordability, cost of living, housing, workforce shortages. I don't think these themes or these words will come as a surprise if you have been keeping up with the news over the past few years or following along on Front Porch Forum. These are the themes that are affecting every community around the state. So what is this about? It's about connecting the dots, right? So those symptoms, some of the words in that word cloud, these are the headlines, but we have to be able to take a step back and ask, what are some of the root causes that lead to these symptoms? That's where the data tells a very powerful story. We built this plan on the 2 pillars of people and places, specifically demographics and housing scarcity. So we'll dive into some of that data. This is Vermont's age distribution from the year 2000. Now, my least favorite part about presenting this data is admitting that that was 26 years ago. It's great. It hurts to say that. But what you'll notice is there was a relatively large working age population compared to the number of children and elderly. That dark green, that's the 25 to 49 age cohort. There were about 226,000 Vermonters in that age group 26 years ago, and only about 77,500 in the 65 plus cohort. Now, if we fast forward and take a look at more recent data, you'll see the shape of that chart has shifted drastically. That 25 to 49 cohort has decreased by over 30,000. The 65 plus cohort has nearly doubled. Now, what does this mean from an economic perspective, from a labor force perspective? It means our workforce is shrinking. It means our tax base is shrinking. It means that overall healthcare needs of our population have increased. It means there are fewer children in our schools. These have real economic impacts. In terms of the labor force, the central analysis in this economic action plan takes a look at the long-term workforce supply and demand balance. And it's not balanced right now. There's quite a large gap. On an annual basis, Vermont is expected to lose about 17,150 people to retirement each year. Right? That's how many people are leaving the workforce. Now, to put that in context, there are about 5,300 12th grade students in the entire state of Vermont. right? Yeah, that's the right response. Those two numbers don't balance out. We don't retain 100% of those 12th graders. And even if we add the college grads that we retain and the inbound migration that we've seen in recent years, there's still a gap. So Vermont needs more people, especially working age people, young families, to move to Vermont to help close this gap in the long term. Now, when we take labor market data and population data and superimpose the two, here's the chart that we get. The blue bars represent the number of people in each of those age cohorts that are highlighted. And then the green bar that's superimposed on top shows the number of people in the labor force in that age category. So what you'll notice is that most working age adults are participating in the labor force, but the reason why our overall labor force participation rate has been dropping is, again, because of retirements, because of demographics. Now, there isn't anything inherently wrong with that, but long term, we have to be able to support our economy through a robust workforce. And if we have people leaving the workforce, we need new people coming in. We can do that in two ways. There's expansion strategies and efficiency strategies. Efficiency says, how do we do more with what we have? How do we remove barriers to labor force participation? And expansion says, how can we add to that? I often look at data and try to translate it into ways that I understand, and that's often sports analogies. So when I take a look at this, I think of this as Team Vermont. Let's call it a college sports team. And we have a lot of seniors that are going to be graduating from our workforce soon, retiring. And we need to do a little bit more to recruit the next class of freshmen or transfer sophomores from other states. That's how we're going to sustain the success of Team Vermont in the long term. So that's the Vermont data. Now, I've pulled from the Census Bureau Dorset data so that you can get a feel for how local data compares to the state. I'll go back to that state data. So here's the shape of the state chart. And you'll see the Dorset one is pretty similar, actually a little bit more of a gap in that 35 to 44 age range. And you see the unbalanced nature of it with, again, many folks that are at or near retirement age. So back to this idea of connecting the dots. We're going to put demographics and housing together now, because as I mentioned earlier, housing is really about people and the needs of community. One of the items on the table as you were walking in were preliminary findings on the housing market analysis of this region. And this was compiled by community scale. And I'm just going to share some of the highlights before I wrap up and turn it over to Moreau. Some of the really surprising and optimistic findings were that Dorset, unlike the rest of Bennington County and the state as a whole, has actually been getting younger. If you take a look at the number of people in each age cohort as a percentage of the overall population, there's been growth in the younger age cohorts. And again, that is in contrast to what's happening around the broader county and the state as a whole. Now, that leads to the housing question. What's happening in the market and how is it meeting or not meeting the needs of people who are here and the people that might want to be here as well. Local median income has steadily risen over time, and we've also seen that average home sales prices have gone up significantly as well. There was this critical period during the early days of the pandemic. That chart on the right, there's a gray shaded column representing that COVID era market. And what happened there was a lot of in-migration to the state of Vermont, increased demand in the Vermont housing market, right? And we saw prices go up. And we've also seen that those homes have been purchased, and just in terms of viability, they've been purchased by folks with higher median income. So we've seen an influx of folks that are bringing higher incomes and putting pressure on a scarce market. And when that happens, prices will continue to rise. What this means is with a finite and scarce housing supply, it can lead to displacement. Previous residents may feel priced out in the market or feel compelled to sell when prices are high, but they can't stay in the local community because there are no options that are within their attainable range. So we see this sort of hollowing out of the middle in the data. Now, just taking a look at some of the recent listings and how they're spread out geographically, you see some corridors here around the town where there's this divergence of the lower sales prices near those corridors and then some of the higher value properties farther away from the corridor. And then we also need to take a look at how the mix of units and the residence type has shifted as well. Dorset's market is made up of mostly detached single-family homes, and we've seen a decrease in the number of full-time residents over the years, and the share of vacant units has risen as well. So I share this analysis by community scale, but want to, again, come back to this idea of people, community, and intersect it with the labor market. So one of the ways to think about this is who is working in Dorset versus who is living in Dorset, how much overlap is there, and how much of your local workforce actually lives here. I call this Dorset's 83% opportunity. So I pulled some census data from their Center for Economic Studies, and they estimate about 712 jobs in Dorset town. Only 124 of those are filled by people who live in Dorset. So 588 people employed here in Dorset live somewhere else. 83% of the workforce in Dorset don't live here. That's the opportunity. Many of them would probably like to, or at least like to know that it's an option. And right now, it's not. I took a look at Zillow right before this meeting started. There are 16 total listings in the town of Dorset. And many of them are well above the range that would be affordable to, let's say, essential workforce, a local teacher. So you may not get 100% of those 588 to move to Dorset, and that's okay. But if some of them do want to move, it represents an opportunity where housing can help to fill that gap. Having choice in the market for people to locate themselves closer to economic opportunity, closer to friends and family, that only strengthens a community. So back to big picture towards affordability and abundance, just to level set what I mean by this. This is a Venn diagram within the Economic Action Plan. This was one of the central themes in our work, to just ask Vermonters, what do you want out of the future for your community? What do you want for the future of this state? How do we use data to understand where we are and where we might want to go? As I mentioned earlier, cost of living and affordability kept rising to the top in terms of the things that people felt were holding them back from their full potential or holding the state back. So if we want lower cost of living, there's two ways to get there. We can take a scarcity pathway, and that will lead to service cuts. It might mean that some programs that currently exist have to be eliminated. It might mean that you don't have the workforce to get all the things done that you might want to do, like plow when there's a snowstorm, right? That will lower costs if you cut expenditures, but it can also lead to dire long-term consequences, because if you're thinking about how to attract the next generation of people to your town, young families, and you're starting to cut things like schools or hospital services, it gets infinitely harder to attract those people. But the other option is an abundance pathway, which is to accelerate housing, grow the working age population. As we see at the macro scale for Vermont, we have far more retirements than the number of young people who are available to enter the workforce. So being able to attract more people here only strengthens the workforce and grows that tax base. This is where Vermont stands right now nationally in terms of state tax collections per capita. We're number 3, third highest, right? I'm an inherently competitive person, but I don't want to be first on this list. I'd rather we get off of the podium. The other blue bars here are the New England states. You'll see most of them are in the top half, New Hampshire being the outlier. So again, where we go from here is a choice. Now, when we poll Vermonters broadly, here's some data that I think will just be interesting and helpful to understand. One of the questions I've been tracking over a few years is, are you supportive of growing Vermont's population size to strengthen its workforce? And you see results here from 2022 compared to 2025. There's an increase in the number of people that are saying yes, that are recognizing and connecting the dots between demographics, housing, and affordability. Now, when we ask this next question about housing, it's asked at 3 different scales. Are you supportive of creating new housing to increase the population in Vermont writ large? What about in your town? What about in your neighborhood? And what we've found is, again, an increase in the number of people saying, yes, I'm supportive. I'm supportive across the state of Vermont. I'm supportive in my town. And I'm even supportive in my neighborhood. And yes, there's a little bit more uncertainty and perhaps even opposition the closer to home it gets. So sometimes you may live next to conserved land and it might not make sense to build there. Sometimes you might live next to a place that's already developed, right? So there might be practical reasons why folks are saying no. But what I like to highlight on this slide is that at every scale, at the Vermont scale, at the town scale, at the neighborhood scale, there are more yes responses than no responses. So Vermonters are picking a spot on this Venn diagram. They're saying, we're okay with a little bit more density because I really like the services and the programs that we have. I totally understand this as a proud Vermonter. I love the way, the ethos that we bring to our communities to say, how do we take care of our neighbors? How do we take care of each other, right? And that's what services are really about. And I also want to be able to afford it. I want to be able to stay in Vermont long term. So an abundance pathway is the one that, when we take a look at the broader data across Vermont, is where Vermonters want to go. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a blanket policy, though. This Venn diagram I share with you as a tool, right? You all get to decide for your community. And my feeling is that having data to begin that discussion of understanding where we are and where we want to go is a great way to bring people together for productive discourse. So with that, I'll pass it over to Morale.
Well, thank you, Kevin. I really think Vermont's very lucky to have you stepped into this role and do this type of work, adding a lot of clarity, a lot of data to the choices that we face as a state. This is the first time Kevin and I have actually spoken at the same event, which is fortunate for all of you, and that a lot of times I try to steal as many of Kevin's slides as I can and then do a bastardized job of communicating them. And
it's not my data, it's our data. Most of that's from the Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I've just translated it, but we've all actually paid for that with our tax dollars. It's our data.
You do a great job communicating. My name is Maria Weinberger. I'll follow Kevin's lead, say a little bit of how I come to this conversation, what brought me here. I too am a lifelong Vermonter. I grew up not too far up the road from here in Heartland, and high school in Woodstock, Vermont. Left the state for my 20s, but moved back to Burlington in my early 30s. Had really spent pretty much my whole career one way or another in housing. I was an affordable housing developer before moving back to Vermont, and then had my own company in Burlington called the Heartland Group that built a couple hundred homes from northern Vermont to southern New Hampshire. A lot of what we ended up getting built was actually in New Hampshire because we found it hard to build in Vermont. Then hopefully some of you know me from my 12 years as the mayor of Burlington from 2012 to 2024, where I continued to work a lot of things, of course, but housing was one of the big initiatives that we focused on. We really perceived that we had a housing supply issue in Burlington. Cost of housing had gotten very expensive. We were seeing some of the displacement that Kevin was sort of pointing to there, of younger households being displaced by older, wealthier households, and that had coincided with a period of building very little housing. We tried to turn that around. We had some success with that. We built or at least got into construction about 2,000 homes during the 12 years I was mayor, which was, depending on how you measure, we like to say like a 4-fold increase in the rate of new housing being built. And since leaving office almost 2 years ago now, I have been part of this group. Oh, I gotta bring up my PowerPoint here. I've been a part of Let's Build Homes. Helped start this organization, and I do have a slide deck here. We launched Let's Build Homes about a year ago, and this is our mission is, we have chosen a side. I'll be upfront about that in terms of the Venn diagram. We believe in the abundance pathway. We think that is a brighter future for the state, for our children. We think there's a way to get to abundant housing for households of all income levels, but doing it in a way where the housing that it's built is, and these new communities thrive in harmony with our working lands. I mean, that's explicitly a nod to some of the issues we'll get into, I think, tonight, and certainly in my presentation, that we think there's a way and a need to build more homes, but to do it in a focused way, to do it building largely in and around our existing settled areas. And we think that growing in that way mitigates the concerns that I think many folks have about growth and what it will do to the Vermont landscape that we love, that in many cases brought us here or kept us here. The idea with Let's Build Homes, and this is actually an early example of it, we think that housing decisions are being made in really kind of all levels of Vermont governance. Certainly decisions being made in the State House by the governor have a big impact on housing, but local decisions have a big impact too. And so whereas our first year as a new organization was very focused on the legislature, we are trying to, now that we've become a little bit, we've sort of moved from being a board-driven organization to having a little bit of staff capacity. We're trying to be a resource and be involved in local housing decisions like the ones you all will face in the months ahead. And so that's why we're here. One additional thing to point out of the box that's sort of subsumed in this, and that is a little bit different than the way I think a lot of past housing initiatives have unfolded in Vermont, and what they've been focused on is we think there's a need for more homes for all of our neighbors, for Vermonters of all income levels. A lot of past housing initiatives have been focused on housing the most vulnerable, and Vermont has a lot to be proud of there. Old colleague Brian Pine is here, working with the City of Burlington. The City of Burlington was great on building permanently affordable housing. The state has been focused on that. We have a problem because because we think fundamentally the issue is a supply issue, as Kevin now, and what we see as the challenge and the need. We build a lot less housing today in absolute terms and in terms of growth percentage than we did in prior decades. And the decade before, I was just looking at the data, the prior decade, not shown here, is even a bigger year, was really our biggest. We built about 6,000 homes a year in the state in the 70s. We're well below that now. You can see on the rate of growth has dropped to about a third of what it was. And then on the right side graph there, you see, we have been kind of ticking up. We have been making some progress. I think there has been, as Kevin's polling data showed, there's been something of a sea change in the way people are thinking about housing, and that's starting to be reflected in more housing homes getting built. We've gone from about 2,000 homes a year statewide to over 3,000 in recent years, and we think when the 2025 data is in, we'll have another year that's pretty good relative to the last, to what we were doing a decade ago, but still a little more than 3,000 a year. The green is what the Vermont Housing Needs Assessment projects we need to be building at to address the impacts of the current housing shortage, to address the shortage that has built up over decades. And so it's a little bit confusing when you look at that. There's sort of the solid green, and then there's a dotted green on top. That represents that their findings in this report, which was done by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, is sort of presented as a range. So, if you're shooting for the low end of the range, you're just at the solid green. At the top end of the range is where the white tops out. We kind of picked the middle one as an organization. We're shooting for 30,000 homes by the end of 2029, which is right there around 5,000 homes a year. And you can see we are well below that, despite having had several decent years. Kevin gave us some great data already, some additional housing data. I think this is complementary. That the shortage that has built up has a really direct impact on the housing market and on the housing experience of many Vermonters. We, for years now, have had one of the highest homelessness rates in the country. Homelessness is a complicated phenomenon in some ways, and there's certainly other factors that contribute to why any one individual or household is homeless. It's very clear that overall the homelessness is a housing problem. The places that have the tightest rental markets, that have the highest rent costs relative to incomes, have the highest homelessness rates. And that's certainly what we think is going on here in Vermont. A full half of the renters in Vermont, so thousands of households out there are cost burdens. They're spending more than 30% of their income on rent, which is sort of a long-standing kind of rule of thumb for how to think about how much a target that you want to spend your housing on. A smaller percentage, but shockingly, a quarter of all renters are spending more than half of their income in rent. And those are the households that, in general, are really in a tenuous place. They're the households that are at risk of eviction and face all the dire consequences that implies. We did pull out of that 30,000 home goal that Bennington County has. The share of that has been sort of allocated by the state to Bennington County is this 1,450 to 2,200 new homes. Just to say a word more about this target, I'll just say I like the target. I think it's a good target for us to be shooting for. It's clearly ambitious. I think what it communicates is that we need to be doing things differently if we are going to be addressing this issue. I also think it's an achievable target, and I say that based on the graph on the left, where you don't have to look that far back into our history to see a time when we were growing at a very different rate than we are now. I saw Burlington in my time there, make a commitment to change its housing trajectory, and it wasn't easy, and it was slow, but over a decade plus, there was a real change in the trajectory. And you look out around the country, and there's a growing number. There are a lot of places that are facing this issue. I think Vermont has an acute shortage, one of the worst housing shortages, but there are many states that are facing some form of this, and a lot of them are starting to take action on this, and you're seeing an impact both in an increase in the number of homes that are getting built, and then what you would expect, what the economists would hope would happen, of a flattening of rents, or even a reduction of rent prices and for sale prices. Some of the biggest examples of this have been in kind of major metropolitan areas like Minneapolis and Austin. But interestingly, I think, there have been a number of rural places that have been taking this on as well. There's a lot of talk right now of the Montana miracle because Montana faced, a lot of acute pressures. There was a lot of influx of Californians and other West Coasters moving there. And in response to that, there's a lot of building going on there. And they're pretty proud of the progress in terms of housing costs that they've been experiencing. I think this kind of restates a lot of what we've said about the last bullet. To be really explicit, we're not advocating here just we think homes of all shapes and sizes for all of our neighbors is what's necessary. In some cases, the shortage is around downtown apartment buildings. In other cases, the shortage is felt with a lack of townhomes or condominiums or small starter homes. We're for all that. How do we, sometimes when I'm doing a talk like this, we get questions about how we got to this place, and it's not an easy question to answer. There's not a single answer. There are a lot of things that contributed, from my perspective, to why we become one of the hardest states in the country to build in. This is this is not a complete list, but it starts to, I think, point at the layers of state and local regulations that have been added over decades that have created a very challenging environment to build new housing in. Let's Build Homes certainly doesn't think the answer to that is just to get rid of all of these things. Certainly, there is, these represent important values and goals that we need to continue to regulate and protect. I think in some ways we have a harder task than just sort of going in and Doge-like blowing up. We had the goal, and I think where we need to go is to find a way to get these rules right, because in many cases we have gotten to a place where they are unworkable. How do we protect our wetlands while also not forcing builders to wait years to get a permit? How do we protect what is truly historic and valuable, not create a situation like we do in Burlington where just anything old adds, in some cases, months and years of time to a project moving forward. I'm happy to get in more of that if people want to talk about any of that. A couple more data points to show that something really is happening. This shows how after a long period of time, the average first-time home buyer price in the country was around 30. It has risen all the way to 40. Most of that since the pandemic.
Age, not price.
Yes, sorry if I misstated that. The average, age of a first-time home buyer has gone from something that people generally do in their late 20s, early 30s to, on average, people are buying their first home at 40, which to me, and hopefully this is just a blip. I mean, a lot of that is relatively recent change, but it does suggest that there's something kind of fundamentally changing about the way the economy works and what it means to start a family, raise a household here, that is concerning. Every politician in the country is trying to run on affordability. This graph just really shows that when we're talking about the affordability challenge, most of what we're talking about is housing. The cost of housing dwarfs all of these other costs, and it the graph is also interesting in that it shows how the cost of housing really peaks in these sort of working age years, and with costs being what it is today, is a real pressure for households in that period. One last graph here. Showing, which is a shocking graph, and this is, I think, more than just a housing story. This is about healthcare costs in Vermont and how much they have gone up since 2014. And you can really see that Vermont is an outlier from the other New England states here. And you know, part of that is, you know, like this gets into a variety of issues. Clearly, the demographic shift that Kevin talked about is a major driver of this. It was interesting about a year and a half ago when the Green Mountain Care Board issued a major report trying to get their arms around what was going on here and pointing towards solutions. Their number one solution for fixing Vermont's troubled healthcare system was to build more homes. They saw certainly the connection, both in terms of what the housing shortage is doing to our demographics, but also in terms of what it's doing to the workforce and hospitals as a really key issue. So, you know, let's go home this evening to turn this around by building a broad coalition to push for change. We are trying to do what we're doing here tonight of being involved in housing policy decisions at all levels. We certainly support continued investment in permanently affordable housing, government investment of public funds. We think that you know needs to remain a focus. And we would also like to participate in what I think is Kevin is showing is already happening, this sort of change in understanding of the problem. The state in many ways has been moving in this direction too at the legislature for the last 2 years. And this is, you know, what I'll finish and focus on. And, each of the last 3 years, the legislature has passed one big housing law, and we're hoping they're going to do that again this year. We'll see. But 3 years ago, they passed something called the Home Act, which in many ways tried to set new standards for local zoning regulations in terms of the amount of housing that must be allowed if you are on town water and sewer. 2 years ago, something called Act 181 passed. This is the first really significant Act 250 reform in 50 years. And I think that this has a number of implications for the state you're talking about, and I'll get into that in a moment. Last year, let's go home's first year, the state passed something called the Community Housing Community Housing and Infrastructure Program, CHIP, as it's referred to. And this is a pretty dramatic change in the way the state supports municipalities that want to build new infrastructure to support new housing. And this too, I think, has real implications for what you may choose to do with the land you have here. So let me get into a little more detail. The Act 181, again, first major reform Act 250 in 50 years. It does quite a number of things. The most significant thing that it did is it said we are going to move from the status quo that had sort of defined Act 250 from the start, which is that Act 250 just applied in a uniform way across the state, to a more strategic plan where some parts of the state that essentially are settled areas, are municipalities that have existing local land use regulations and capacity to manage those regulations. Act 250 will no longer apply in those areas, or at least will be partially exempt. Whereas other parts of the state, the kind of status quo is being maintained, or even there are new environmental protections going in place. But Tier 1, as it's called, these housing growth areas, we're now on our way to having a map of these areas across the state that really represent something of a consensus, at least in the State House and in the legislature, and in the regional planning commissions that have been leading this, or in the process of leading this map making process. There's a consensus that has some weight in the law and that is on its way to being shown on a new statewide map about where we want housing. We've never had that before, and it has the potential to be quite significant. Right now, that map, the only significance of it is that projects in these growth areas, housing projects are either partially or wholly exempt from Act 250, but I believe, and certainly something Let's Build Homes is advocating for, over time there will be more incentives and benefits for housing in these areas that will be added. We have proposed, for example, this year that in these housing growth areas, if we really want to incent this to happen, that builders not pay sales tax on the cost of construction materials in these areas. That that there's some other state tax credits that there's a really low cap on, but maybe in these areas that will be opened up. So I just mentioned that, not to get into a debate about those things, but to say I think already there's some legal import to these housing growth areas, and that's likely to become more significant over time. This gets in, right. I don't know how not to avoid getting into a little bit some of the wonky terms of the legislation, but Tier 1A and Tier 1B are the areas that are eligible for this Act 250 exemption and that are being mapped this way. And what I'm going to show you now is this is a close-up of Dorset. And if you could just picture, if we zoned out a little bit, what you would see is that these pink areas, or purple maybe, the bright light pink and the bright pink areas, those are the Tier 1 eligible areas. That yellow in the middle is a transition area. Maybe, I think the thinking is that at some point that too might become a housing growth area. If we zone back out, and I should have set up the presentation to show this, you would see that these pink areas are a very small percentage of the overall land area of the state. It's, this is a work in process, so no one knows exactly where that's going to land, but the estimates are that between 2 and 3% of the state is going to fall into this housing growth area where housing is encouraged. And what I think is quite significant to this conversation is that Raptor Lane, where we're sitting right now, is squarely within this sort of village center area that is eligible for tier 1 status. So we're sitting in the middle of an area where the state has sort of looked at the challenges that Kevin talked about, looked at this shortage, come up with a theory of the case for how to address it. They say the way we're going to address it is we're going to have these areas that we're going to make it easier to build housing, and you own land collectively right in the middle of one of those areas. Quickly, and then I'll open up for questions. Really, last slide I have. Here's how the community housing infrastructure program works. This is, I think, properly understood is potentially, if it's used, and I think it is going to be used. There's a lot of interest in this. If it is widely used, this will be the largest infrastructure initiative the state has ever taken on. It allows essentially up to $200 million a year to be invested in new infrastructure that supports housing, and it's a 10-year bill. So up to $2 billion could ultimately be invested in this. And here's how it works. Sorry, I'm sure many of you in the room have kind of heard of this kind of structure before, but this essentially is the use of something called tax increment financing. Tax increment financing is a very elegant kind of policy solution. Brian and I use it a lot in Burlington. It basically, frequently, municipalities are in a situation where if they want to grow the grand list, if they want to encourage private investment that adds to the built environment, adds to the assets, the improvements in the ground, and thus increases the amount of taxes that municipality can charge, new public infrastructure needs to be built to make that private investment possible. And that can be a bit of a catch-22. You can look out into the future years and see that there are millions of dollars out there of new tax revenue that could help the city, but millions to access those millions of dollars, there's hundreds of thousands or some smaller figure, but significant figure of public investment that needs to be made upfront to make that future a reality. Tax increment financing kind of solves that catch-22. It says that a municipality can borrow funds up front, build the infrastructure, and then pay for it with the new future revenues that are generated. It's a politically elegant and effective tool as well, in that to build that new public infrastructure, the city doesn't need to go out and charge its existing taxpayers new taxes, raise their taxes to get this done. It is building this infrastructure off this the new development that is going to happen, and capturing those future revenues. Up until last spring, only a handful, Burlington had done this a lot. A handful of other, mostly Chittenden County communities, had also been able to use this tool, but Vermont made it very, very difficult for municipalities to access this tool. They did it for sort of well-intended reasons. It kind of comes largely from the fact that Vermont is fairly unique in having a statewide education tax. So, I'm not sure what it is here in Dorset, but in Burlington, about 65-70% of the taxes the municipality collects get sent to the state for the education fund. And the state basically said, since this is mostly our money, we don't want many of these deals taking place. That changed last spring dramatically. The state has now basically said any new housing project, any municipality that has a housing project that it supports can sign an agreement with the builder and go to the state board called VEPC, Vermont Economic Project Progress Council, and get approval to put a tax increment financing deal, a CHIP deal, in place for that project. It's a much simpler transaction than the kind of district-wide TIF districts that Brian and I worked on up in Burlington. It is another difference from the old TIF program is it actually, and this is great for municipalities, I think, is the state now says the developer can actually be the one to take on the new debt and just rebate on the taxes. So through that change, you no longer really have the municipality taking any financial risk. The municipality can still end up owning all this new public infrastructure, but they don't have to be the ones to take any kind of financial risk in getting it built. And so 30 other states have that kind of formulation, and Vermont now does too. So I guess I go in some detail on this just so that you know that you have this tool available to you that I think means that if you do decide this is something the town wants to move forward with, this new tool can sort of fundamentally change the economics of a project like the one that's being contemplated. It has a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built, and maybe
That's great.
Well, still.
gosh, I put you all to sleep so that the motion center. Well, that's the end of what I have to say.
That's our cue.
Yeah.
Such an efficient building with the lights. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Ro. I think that there's been some questions in the chat. We'll try to make the materials from the meeting available. Stick them on the website, make them available for everybody to dive into and to learn more about. I think that kind of in the spirit of the rest of the meeting tonight, we're happy to open the floor up to questions. The hope is to have a general discussion about what you just heard, questions about aspects of what you just heard, and how it might impact Dorset and Raptor Lane. We'll give preference to the folks in the room right now. Bill.
I agree with all your statements about the housing costs, and the shortages and so on. But here's the question I don't hear anybody talking about. You do a 1,200 square foot unit today, and you have, let's say, one-car attached garage, and it's on a foundation. And I'm going to assume that the land and infrastructure is there. It's not costing anything. What's it cost per square foot to build?
Too much. I mean, and it's really spiked in recent years. There's a lot of work going on to, and you're right. So CHIP was a way to take a bunch of cost off, without something like that, you have to add maybe $50,000, $75,000 a home, maybe, to the cost of the project. But even if you take it off, like you suggest, new construction today is very expensive. So this is somewhat self-perpetual. One of the reasons it's so expensive to build housing in Vermont is that we don't have enough workforce housing and we don't have enough workers, and that drives costs up. But, there are other steps that need to be taken to address that. And there's a lot of work going on there, but it is too much. It's too high.
Okay, so to stretch that a little further, one of the added costs that everybody needs to be cognizant of, I know you're doing, but was our drive towards these zero net energy standards. That added 20% to the cost in 2021. Then you had the cost of construction, which boosted things up at least another 25%. And so if you take 1,200, I'm going to say $400 a square foot for round numbers. If anybody can beat that, stand up and tell me, okay? So you're at $480,000. Add $50,000 on for a lot, $70,000 for easy math, $550, and then you have the down payment of 20%. The problem is, to meet the missing middle, who can afford to take out a mortgage or meet the mortgage standards for a $450,000 mortgage? And that's what you're missing. I'm building houses right now and I can't sell them because people can't pay that mortgage. That's what you have to focus on. All these others are nibbling, or items you talked about are nibbling around the issues. I had no issue with my Act 250 permit. I have plenty of density. I'm doing potentially 20 units on 3.5 acres. That's not an issue. I'm on a water and sewer district. I was able to cut those costs down, but I have $100,000 before I build a house, and then at $400 a square foot. Yeah. The middle class, Vermont's middle class, can't afford the prices of our homes today. So you have to think of another program to help home buyers to get into the market. You got to subsidize buying houses. You subsidize rent. You help buyers get into the market. We subsidize rents forever. We're subsidizing rents up in Wilson for a project that was $700 a square foot. Blows my mind. But we'll subsidize rents forever.
I mean,
Bill, thanks. I think
I just very quickly, I totally agree with you. I think that we have real challenges with the high cost of construction today. I don't know if it's always as dire as exactly the economics you laid out there, but it often is. And we do, if you're curious, Let's Build Homes has a whole platform that we've released, and we have recommendations in a number of areas, and a bunch of them are in around ideas around bringing the cost of construction down and new assistance for owning and renting in the state. So there's a lot, there's a lot of work going on in those areas as well. I don't think we should let those. Those are additional challenges to getting a project up. I think this project, or the decision you're facing now, is if you even want to kind of try to get to the point of starting to deal with those issues. And the decision has to be made, as I understand it, do you want to move forward with this project? And that's a somewhat different decision, I think. And
I'll just quickly respond to that. I love your question because it makes me think of potential future research projects that I can do. So you're keeping me in a job. One thing that the Futures Project recently released is a competitiveness dashboard where across a variety of metrics, we compare how Vermont ranks relative to other states. And you're making me think I should do a national analysis on cost per square foot to build. Now, the reason why I mention this is because one of the ideas in the Economic Action Plan is let's take this overwhelming task of building housing and start to break it apart into the component pieces, then start to ask, what do we have control over as a state, as a community, to impact and bring that cost down, right? We break down the categories into 5 L's. There's the land, the labor, the lumber, lending, and the laws, right? So within each of those categories, what can we affect? we don't set federal interest rates. That's a factor. Let's set it aside. So what can we affect? The book Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson highlighted the cost to build 1 unit of affordable housing in California versus Texas. And in California, it costs almost 4 times as much for the same square footage, same materials, right? And Vermont currently is a little bit closer to California regulations than we are to Texas. Some of those things we can change or influence and impact if we choose to, right? So that's why I say we have a choice. We've made choices in the past. That doesn't mean that has to be the status quo forever.
I strongly suggest you do that.
Justine?
Yeah, so I find it odd to be talking about housing without talking about wages. And the number of jobs in Dorset, how, if you don't know what they pay, that seems like a huge piece of data that you need right away. And if the rule of thumb is that it's 3 times your salary is what you could sort of afford for a home, and most of the jobs might be minimum wage, or maybe people will be earning $50,000, they're not going to be able to afford a $150,000 home unless you're doing like a modular, like a small modular, something like that. But it doesn't, I think homeownership is really, really important for a community, particularly for Dorset. And Burlington, I've heard, is a cautionary tale, actually, with the housing. Because in 1989, it was considered a particularly beautiful city, barely any crime, no graffiti, no bikes being stolen. And in 2022, it had the highest murder rate since the 1960s. I know that's
Wasn't from, I mean, just to be really clear, that wasn't from building more housing. That was,
Yeah, Justine,
we lost,
okay, but anyway, it's just it's tricky. It's tricky when you dive in
we lost
without.
40% of our police department, and, you know, just.
But I think there's
line.
a holistic part of the conversation that has to be really looked at from all angles. Like who would be buying the homes, and is the scale going to make sense for Dorset? And I think, you know.
Maybe we could try to answer the first question
Yeah.
first, right? The wage stuff?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
No, you're asking great questions, right? Because affordability is a 2-sided equation. There's the wages and then there's the cost, right? And we need to make sure that what is built or what's available is also attainable based on the wages. I put in the Zoom chat, and I can follow up with additional materials to show a breakdown of those 712 jobs that I mentioned in Dorset. We can take a look at roughly what the monthly wages are for each of those jobs. I can tell you right now that 419 of them are more than 3,333 per month. That's just sort of the way the census has it broken out, but I'll try to add more detail in a follow-up. We can also break down by geography. Where are those workers traveling from? I know that more than 10% of those workers in Dorset are traveling from farther than 50 miles. About 11% are traveling from a 25 to 50 mile range. So there are ways that we can start to add more detail to who might desire housing in Dorset based on the local job market.
Can I, sorry,
Megan?
ask a question? Oh, was there a second part to that question? I'm sorry. Okay, have you analyzed any data on how short-term rentals have affected the housing market in communities? Because I know rentals in particular, just anecdotally, I hear that, you know, it's something that's kind of dried out. Is that something that's been?
So I've not analyzed what's going on here in locally. We did engage that issue in Burlington, and we did end up passing some pretty significant short-term rental regulation that both limited the amount of units that could be rented in one property and put a pretty high tax on that short-term rental, so that it was a pretty significant new source of money for our housing trust fund. You know, I do think there are certainly communities around the state where the scarcity of homes means that in the short term, you really are faced with there is this sort of zero-sum game, and there is this competition between short-term rentals and permanent residents. And I can certainly understand, and the decision we made was to do what we could to try to protect permanent residents. Even at its worst in Burlington, which definitely was feeling like it was impacting, I think, we had something like 20,000 housing units in Burlington. And I think the highest documented number of short-term rentals were right before the pandemic. And there was, I think the numbers, if I remember right, it's like it was around 600 units. So not a insignificant number, but also that was sort of putting in perspective. It was not massive. I think there are other communities where looking at some kind of impact makes some sense. But I will say, it pained me just from my perspective on it to have to do this, in that there were certainly positive things to the community of having short-term rentals. It was wealth building for some of our homeowners and residents. It was, we're a community that gets significant economic vitality from the hospitality industry and people visiting. And so a better future, I thought, would be one where there's enough homes and beds that we could serve both of these markets. Again, to use Kevin's language of sort of choosing an abundant path, I think is ultimately where, I think it results in better outcomes.
Can I just follow up
Yeah.
with one question, because you mentioned a housing trust fund, and I have heard that as certain alternatives. Could you just describe what you did with that and how that worked?
Yeah, and I don't know the stats, and I don't know, Rob, if you do, on how many communities in Vermont have housing trust funds. There are a number of them. We just actually, on the way down, we had a meeting up the road in Chester, and they set up a housing trust fund about a year ago and have revenue from a number of sources flowing into it. Burlington's was so the way it worked in Burlington is there was a property tax, a piece of your property taxes went in every year, and it was about basically a penny on the overall tax rate. And then something that happened while I was in office is we added this short-term rental, and then we also, it gets into a very Burlington specific issue, but we have an inclusionary zoning ordinance, which, we really don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but there was a third major source of revenue. What we used the money for, what basically was to support permanently affordable. That's for the most part, the creation of new permanently affordable homes. It was
So it went towards the construction.
It went basically to the construction costs or the organizations that were doing that work. And it was significant, not in terms of total dollars. What we were able to put in, even with a mature, fairly established fund, was small relative to the cost of the housing, but it was flexible money and it was early money, and it helped projects. If you had a housing trust fund now, as you're taking on a project like this, it might provide some of that early money that gets a project moving. That's one of the biggest values of having one.
Okay, I'm going to pause just a second. So we've had a little bit of online discussion, kind of in the vein of Justine's question related to employers, employment. I'm going to try to kind of throw it open to maybe there's employers in the audience here tonight or online that could kind of chime in to maybe some of their experiences hiring and the kind of in the market and how housing might impact that. So I'm going to is there anybody willing to kind of testify to that perspective?
Nobody's hiring.
Colin?
Yeah, sure. I work at Long Trail School. We employ about 60 people. 57 of them are full-time. 3 of them are part-time. There's 3 of us that live in Dorset. So we've got, that's just one place, but there, I think, aligns with the data that Kevin shared. And I would say probably 90% of them would love to live closer to where they work, if not 100% of them. The biggest challenge is in the hiring is Even we've had several instances where even after someone has, in theory, accepted a position, finding housing has been prohibitive. We've had recent hires that are going to New York, looking in New York. And I think we're lucky that we have really strong retention with excellent faculty. And at some point, there's turnover, and that's I think the long-term ramifications. That right now you might be okay because people are steady and stable, and we have, knock on wood, remarkably lucky that the retention's high. The challenge is that then if you don't have quality faculty, or you can't attract quality people, who are the families that then want to live in a place where they're sending their kids to school, right? And this isn't just here, at this statewide, but also I can speak just as a parent of 3 young kids that is the thing that my wife and I care about most, right? Is what the school where you're going to send your children and do they get a good education? I think we're really lucky here. We have amazing schools, but if we look out a little bit further, once folks start to retire or once folks start to move away, the way we keep those young families that you pointed in Dorset is that they have confidence in the schools, and you have confidence because you have excellent teaching. So it's a real problem for us in not actually attracting people, being able to find a place for people whom we've already attracted to this area. And I think Bill's points are spot on too, because I understand it from the development side that it's kind of like a snake eating its head here, right? Or its tail, excuse me. It's going round and round. So I don't know the solution, but I think the fact that there's this much engagement, and if that perspective can be helpful at all, I'd love to be part of the conversation of things that we see about the people who we're talking about, we want to attract and keep here.
Kevin?
I just want to make a point that I only employ one person, and she lives in West Paulet, so that's probably typical. But I think when we keep on talking about affordable, I thought the goal of this program is probably not going to, is just trying to build more affordable housing, because right now the average is way beyond reach of a 2-income couple, and this would put it within reach. And so if we just think of this whole, the aspiration, it's well before any concrete stage, but we're just trying to attempt to create more affordable housing. That's all, and that maybe we can do.
And I guess one of the pivot points there too is another kind of piece from online is that there's, in some of the discussions at the housing committee level here and Dr. Lane and what goes on, there has been quite a bit of kind of discussion about folks that are folks that are old and retired that maybe want to downsize. Who's got the phone on? So there were some comments online about seniors looking to downsize, and that's kind of a component that was tried to be contemplated a little bit in the conceptual study. So I kind of open the floor to that kind of thinking as well, if there's thoughts on that.
Just one thing on the affordable, like big A affordable and small A affordable. I think what we're talking about largely is like middle income housing, right? Yes. And I think that's really important because the price that you end up putting something on the market for might be quasi affordable, but still not affordable to, let's just say, a teacher.
Yeah, so we're talking, it's a little generic and abstract to just say affordable housing. So build this at $200 a square foot. So 400. So that's really out for affordable housing, right? So then, if those are single units, 1,200 square foot units with a garage. So then, what are we talking about looking for affordable housing? I would, to my mind, condominiums. Is that a possibility? And then, what kind of density are you looking at for condominiums? Do you want all the density in one place? I could barely turn in here coming tonight because there were plaques and cars down the road. You'd have to put a light down there. So, you talked about, different sites, things like that, affordability. So I just think it's helpful to start to think of actualities. Bill's example, not affordable. As Colin just brought up, middle income. right? But we know people in the area, you know, they rented, they got booted out, they're in Danby now, they have to travel much further, and yeah. I think it would be great, I think it's great, but what becomes affordable? How do we build affordable? Not theoretically with the chips and all the other stuff.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there, you know, the discussion around prefabricated units and then multi-unit buildings, I think is the thing, typically where that goes, so. And the question in the back?
Yeah, my name is Carrie, and I actually did research on how to attain affordable housing in Vermont for my master's thesis. And what I discovered was there's a couple of things that make it affordable. Number one is creating PUDs, which are planned unit developments, and building multiple houses at the same time, which really reduces your construction costs. But it also comes to value engineering every single aspect of that building, from your foundation to the roof, and really looking at every single layer while you're constructing it, so that you're saving 5% at every single margin instead of looking at the whole thing. I was able to get a house down to $275 a square foot in my plan. And the houses were very livable, 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Square is the cheapest way to build a house, using a gable roof. And really looking at a combination of old building technology along with new building construction technology, but really building multiple units at a time. These were not condominiums. It's more like Bill's structure, where you have lots of small houses close by in a pocket type community. So I guess, yes, I do believe it is possible. Building 6 houses at a time is much more affordable than 1 house at a time. And maybe bringing in containers of, materials that you need. And also looking at the possibility of bringing construction crews from outside of the state, because everyone here is busy all the time. A lot of times just doing renovations on second homes. But also really addressing, is it possible to do PUDs? Are they welcome, where you can buy, 10 acres and really do a planned development?
Thank you, Karen.
How do you keep these from becoming second homes, which would defeat the purpose?
Can you restate the beginning?
How do you keep these units from becoming second homes, which would defeat the purpose of, what you're trying to do is build a house for a local guy who wants to stay here and have his kids go to Dorset school.
Sure.
But somebody figures out what's going on up there and said, ooh, I can buy a nice little second home for, $400,000 and rent it out when I'm not using it. How do you stop that? How do you govern that?
Sure. You guys can back me up a little bit, but generally with subsidized units, there's a structure around covenants or restrictions as to depreciation over time.
Yeah.
But typically, there's a shared equity model where there's it would be limited to people within a certain income range, and then there would be money that kind of stays with the unit that potentially keeps the unit affordable over time. One good example that we have in Dorset is located at Culver Lane, which is off of 7A in East Dorset. There's about a 10-acre development. There's, I believe, 24 units of apartments, and then there's 4 unlanded single families. The 4 unlanded single families are in that zone of what you're talking about, trying to keep it at a certain price over time. That would be in theory, the way it would be structured.
So at point of purchase, there are regulations that would stop somebody from doing.
Yeah, there would be the entity that kind of oversees the unit would be, there's deed restrictions that go with it, and there's a process that has to be followed.
Hey, Chris, can you just talk conceptually about, I'm just getting caught up on this, where the development is compared to here? I mean, is it below us? Is it above us? If above us, how much further up? Is it that way? And you're talking 125 homes, is that right?
So I'll put a little bit of a pin in some of that. I can get you the geography, the general kind of conceptual idea that we're talking about at this point, and we'll really dive into it at the next meeting. But is up here, you come in, you kind of across the driveway, there's a road, there's two roads that kind of go to the north. The conceptual plan and even the plan that was drawn out in some of the capacity study work that the town's engineer did focused on about 40 acres along this flat strip that's just to the north of the building. That's kind of the area that's been the focus point. To back up a little bit, the town got this lower campus property in 2018, and we've done quite a bit of other work to define where the developable areas are, where it's suitable, where it's appropriate. There's a lot of background stuff that's on the website if you want to kind of check that out to better understand why the focus is in that one area. And putting a pin in, we're definitely going to have more conversation about the concept and the unit count and all that stuff at the next meeting. We're trying to, again, there's a lot of stuff to digest. We've already, kept you here for almost 90 minutes. So we want to continue on. So thank you. For questions in the room. Please.
There was a question that just popped up on the screen.
Okay. Can you share what the surrounding communities where people would have reasonable commutes, Manchester, Paulet, Rupert, Rutland, are doing to add affordable housing? I work for Dorset, so
Manchester voted it down.
Manchester, yeah, I don't know what you're referring to when you say Manchester voted it down. So I guess I'm not sure how to answer that. I do know that, this conversation around where people live, right? And people maybe work in the area and they could go to Rupert or Paulet or West Paulet or Granville. Some of the data that we're going to get out of the housing market analysis, some of the data that Kevin kind of showed, inventory and prices, inventory is low, not just here, everywhere. And prices have appreciated, not just here, everywhere. So the conversation around, kind of essential workers that work in a community, once they're starting to drive 60 plus minutes to work, that's some of the underpinning around towns are all starting to be aware of that. That's why we're having these conversations. Let's see. We talked about the heat sensitivity. Yeah. Anybody else? Michael.
Since you're a developer, how dense can I go? So in a tier 1B, if I want to be, can I do a 20 unit apartment building? That's how you really move the needle, right? So in Jersey, in Hoboken, we're just building like crazy. And it's, 70 units, 80 units. A friend of mine that just did a project. But you can, if you really want to solve the problem, just build an apartment. Right? So just how dense can I go? If you want to solve a problem, just put up apartment buildings. Can I do that with tier 1B?
So first of all, I want to be clear. I was a developer for 15 years of my life. I'm not now. I'm just on the advocacy side. So I'm not as in touch with all the market realities happening currently. I can't speak to what tier 1B. All that designation currently means is that projects in those areas are partially exempt from having to go through Act 50 review. And I believe you can have a project up to 50 units that does not.
I mean, not houses. I want to, if I want to save money, I put people in a box. I put a lot of people. Can I do that?
So it basically depends on what the local zoning is. The answer is what is the answer on this piece of land? Rob would be a better answer.
Yeah, so I think what you're driving at, Mike, is that the tier 1B stuff applies to the state level review. There's still Dorset level review that would be required. I think that the board kind of talked about the zoning bylaw last night at the meeting 2 years ago. It got updated. It went from 85 pages to 220 pages, the document itself. I don't think that the extra pages make anything easier. I'm not sure about that. In my own case, there's a lot more in there. There's stuff about conditional use review for ledge and stuff like that. There's a lot of other hurdles. So the tier 1B isn't just it's not an open door. In our case, it's been tabled. We're not really talking about it, but the town will have to go through its own process to do, the town or the developer will have to go through its own process to get through this as well. Anybody else in the room? We do have a little bit of time. Anybody that hasn't talked? Paul.
Well, Mike's asking a pretty direct question. What's the density in that zone allowed?
Over here?
Yeah.
You'd have to look at the PUD rules within our zoning documents. So it's a 3 acre zone, but I think you can get a unit per 1.5 acres, I believe. We've got 300 acres of land here. On the face of it, I think that's what the rule says. I think part of this process is, what's the number that works for the community, right? It's something that everybody understands, they can buy into, they can appreciate, they understand the need. And then, what's possible and under the rules may be different than what people propose. Another, Carol?
Hi, Rob. I was thinking about the way jobs have changed over, say, the last decade. And I know from the world of healthcare, a lot of hospitals and a lot of clinics have temporary help, they call it. Rent a doc, rent a nurse, and they come and they stay for 3 or 4 months. Their income, the hourly wage is like 3 times what a person who might be a full-time employee. Where do those people fit into any part of this, sort of project? And then my other thought is that if someone wants a nice house and drives to Dorset to work, which we know several people do come from Granville and Salem and Cambridge to work here, have great houses with a little property, affordable, not a long drive, 15 miles, 10, 15 miles. We're dealing with a unique problem that we're on the border of New York State where housing is very affordable. So we have that competition.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think that there's, to try to answer the first question, I think rentals is something that will be part of the, the discussion in terms of what is available, what isn't available, what's needed. The traveling nurse situation probably factors into the reason that I think I had the slide with it costs the 40-year-old $14,000 a year to be on the silver plan. I would imagine that factors into the whole thing. And yeah, the proximity of other things and unit counts and competition and all that stuff, it definitely has to be factored in. So, okay.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about affordability, right? And we have to recognize there are the definitions in terms of how it relates to area media income, but that's usually the capital A affordable, but then there's just the concept of affordability as a relative metric. Someone who is in a $50,000 per year household in terms of income might find something less affordable than if your family income is $500,000, right? And the point about competitiveness, and we are near a state border right now, is a very good one. It was part of why the Futures Project launched a competitiveness dashboard, because we can see where people are moving to, where are they moving from, and across the country, there's a general trend of people moving from higher cost of living places to lower cost of living places. Almost over 500,000 people last year moved to the state of Texas. They're competing on affordability and they're winning. right? So we have these choices of what do we have within our control to make things more affordable. And that is how we're going to compete and win moving forward. And if not, then we're going to continue seeing the current trends play out. And at a very high level, when we're talking about a housing market, when there's more supply relative to demand, that makes the existing housing stock even more affordable as well. So whether it's a capital A or not, new units help to make a market more lowercase a affordable.
I just want to, Suzanne Washburn, you're online. Did you want to say something or ask a question? Can we hear her? She's unmuted. So Suzanne, we can't hear you, so I don't know if you need to speak into the microphone. Suzanne, if you're able, there's a chat function on the platform.
Well, I read that.
Suzanne's lived here a long time, and I would value her input. So we'll let's see. She's still going, but we'll. Suzanne, can you hear us?
Give us a call. Give me your phone number up.
Okay. Okay. So anybody else in the room? A hand up in the back.
Yeah, I've been holding my tongue because they get into that place and take this, but just a couple of points. If you look at your maps, places that stable vacant, they're really second homes, right? That they're not residents here. They probably pay more than half the property tax. Certainly, they and the retirees pay. I don't know, Rob. You have to figure it out, but it's a large percentage. You bring people in to this housing. If it's going to cost those numbers, or you're going to make it affordable for them, it's going to cost a lot of money for each unit. That's coming from somewhere, right? There's no conceivable chance that you're going to get more tax revenue from that than it's going to cost you in a present value, even over, I don't know, 50 years. It's just not going to happen. So this is costing money, and that's fine. But don't sell it as this is a way to raise money for Vermont or the town. It's just not. Mathematically, it cannot conceivably be.
David, do you think the need is great enough that we should be talking about it? I'm sorry?
You have the money. If people are upset about Vermont being, what is it, fourth in the nation or second in the nation at tax burden, this stuff is not free. You can't give away money without taking away from someplace else. It's basic mathematics. So if you can figure out a way to reduce taxes here and bring in all sorts of housing for people and be upset about people commuting from New York, I don't know why that's a problem. But
so growing the grand list isn't an option to lower tax rates? Is that what you're? I don't know.
Yeah, I think back to that Venn diagram I showed you earlier, right? We are currently, as a state and in individual communities, grappling with this affordability challenge, the cost of living challenge. And that is to sustain our current level of services and programs. So something has to give, right? We either choose to grow that grand list, build the tax base to lower per person costs, or we have to make some very tough decisions on what we're willing to let go of. Those are the options without growth.
Look, just if you think about the math, I have no way you're increasing the tax revenues in Vermont more than you're going to spend to do it in this program. I mean, it's just not possible mathematically.
It's happening in a lot of other states.
It may be happening in other places, but it's not happening here.
We should borrow those ideas and adapt.
Well,
I think you're raising
You're
an
going to
important.
compete with Texas. You're smoking French bread. I mean, it's just preposterous.
So if the pie gets bigger, right? I mean, right now there's a limited pie, right? There's only so many slices in the pie. If the pie gets bigger,
you bring in people, figure out for these people what you think they're going to pay in income tax and what you think they're going to pay. Oh, by the way, their property tax actually
isn't gonna go into the state's revenue. It's gonna pay off the cost of the house, right? So don't double count that. And then you figure out whether you think you're really raising net tax revenue from this. There's not an argument against it, because you may think it's valuable to have people, but you're not gonna do this and reduce the tax burden of the state, increase the net above the cost the services demand by the additional population. There's just no way that this will end up being net positive. There's not a saying you can't do it, but at least be honest about the math.
I think you're raising an important question, maybe a question about, about how you're going to approach this, and one that gets into, so, and maybe what you're if I'm understanding you correctly, I think you're envisioning a scenario where the whole project is what we have thought of traditionally as permanently, as big A affordable housing, where yes, there is a gap between what the cost of the home is and what households that are moving in are going to be able to pay, and there are very large subsidies that are needed for a project that is entirely focused on serving very low income or low income households. Certainly the way many communities have approached a situation like this, where you have a major project coming online, there is a decision made to make as much of that, affordable at that deeply affordable level as possible. And that requires government subsidy, and you can only there's only so much of that, and it is very expensive. From my perspective, like in terms of solving the housing shortage, we need communities that are not just trying to build that type of housing. They are trying to build housing that serves the entire market, households that are, fully paying their way. And if getting more of that market rate housing built is also doing something to address this shortage. The main problem as we see it is the shortage of homes, and more homes of all shapes and sizes for people all along that income scale. All of it is contributing to addressing the acute pressures we're under currently. I mean, I'm stunned in the time I've been doing this work, how many bank presidents say to me, how many hospital presidents say to me that they can't hire senior financial positions. They can't hire doctors because the housing that's available on the Vermont market today is so different from what people are expecting when they're thinking about jobs here or elsewhere. So I think we have to broaden what we think of as housing, housing that we need right now, and what is affordable housing. Build as much as we can for the households that are in the greatest need, but more homes for higher end are needed as well.
Yeah, and I think on that same point, the market rate being a potential component of a development, both market rate and affordable, so you're going to get both aspects of that, all of which potentially add units that could be, again, maybe white collar workers could have access to them, and then the affordable units would be, for other workers essentially. So, Brian?
Rob, I just want to note that some of the chat questions we haven't necessarily been able to address them all. But I just want to say we will, and I work directly with Rob as the consultant, we will address them if we can't get to them tonight, I think is what we want to say. There's a few in there that I saw related to CHIP that I can speak to, but it takes a while, and I can get into it if people want to, and I'll do that, but we can also do it in a written Q&A type format.
I think there's one here that I see under the CHIP program. It's from John. Under the CHIP program, if the projected tax increases are less than anticipated, is the town ultimately the guarantor of the CHIP debt?
The answer is no. Unless the municipality is the borrower. So if the municipality is the borrower, in other words, issues a bond and goes through the bond bank and does it that way, then in fact you would be pledging your full faith and credit. But if the developer is the borrower, you are not ultimately responsible. You structure the arrangement so the developer basically has to take on that obligation. If you fall short in tax revenue to service the debt, you structure the deal so the developer has to pay that.
They pay that.
That's the way you do it.
Shortfall. Okay.
There's a question by Steve online that
Go ahead,
was addressed to me, so I'd like to
Yeah.
respond to that. Steve, the point was not that new affordable housing is meant to make the market more affordable by decreasing home values. That is definitely not the point that I was trying to make. The point was that adding units to a market creates more access points across an affordability spectrum. I mentioned that what's affordable to someone at a $50,000 median household income is very different than what's affordable to someone with a $500,000 median household income. But if a new market or a new unit on the market at the higher end is the right fit for that household that has the higher income, and they move to that new unit and vacate a unit that is at a lower price point, then it's created an access point because of these, the nerdy term is mobility chains within the housing market, right? We often think about who is directly benefiting from a new housing unit that's being built, but we very rarely talk about what are the secondary and tertiary impacts when we have housing mobility. And that was the point I was trying to make, Steve, is that more units overall is good because it creates multiple access points of affordability on a relative basis.
Okay.
Could I do one more?
Anybody else that hasn't spoken or have asked a
This is a
question?
good one.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so I know you know the numbers. So the big beautiful bill, opportunity zones, the amount of money that's gone into opportunity zones. Like if you look at Jersey City, literally the skyline in this one area is because it was a low income tract and they said, this is an opportunity zone. You can't stop the money. It's crazy. So this summer they expanded that and they said, we're going into rural areas. We want to have people invest in small towns again. And so what they did, it takes the same thing that all this money has gone into opportunity zones for places like Burlington. I know that you know these numbers. And now it says, hey, you can go into these little towns that are distressed and you can have these same federal tax incentives for developers. The thing is, it's only for low income tracts. Dorset is a very high income area. When I look at these areas, you can go to these small towns, you go to Bennington, go to Rutland, I go around during the summer and I go to the towns and I look at the map. You look around at the properties because you can put together projects in these areas and you can get tons of financing. So have you adjusted these maps where you're kind of like spreading out saying, hey, we want to have all of this development and you say Dorset's this much, Bennington's this much. Have you skewed it towards the areas where the federal money is going to flood?
It's a great question. The opportunity zones is a powerful tool. I don't think there's been, these aren't my maps. These are maps that have been created through this sort of state process. I don't think there's been, really the map making process has been one of identifying existing areas that are essentially established communities, creating some buffer around them, that's really the way these areas, and that these areas also have some administrative capacity at the local level to be eligible for this.
So not Dorset, though.
Dorset is eligible as I understand it, but then what we showed on the map, as I understand it, is what came out of the RPC as the potential future land use map. But to become a tier one, this gets into
Not tier 1B, the opportunity zones.
Being an opportunity zone, I don't think. I'm not super expert in how the new round of maps are being done. I believe the governor's office has a significant role in that, and I don't know where that stands exactly.
It won't.
Yeah, but it won't.
So I think the general sense is that's not a tool that would be available to us here. Just one plug for as part of this process, the town has hired Community Scale, and they are going to do a housing market analysis, which is a pretty deep dive. It's going to look at some of the data slides that Kevin had showed you were from that. It's going to address both wage gap, home ownership, short-term rentals. A lot of stuff is going to be kind of embedded in that. It's going to help us have this conversation about, okay, X number of units. Well, what does the market say about that? And how does that, in the context of the market in Dorset, how does that kind of play out essentially? So I just wanted to plug that real quick. Justine, just a quick follow-up.
Yeah, real quick. Can this project be done with people that exclusively pay their own way, other than getting the land, if they wanted to build a home, like for free, essentially? Could it be done where they're not subsidized going forward, other than the land?
Thanks for the question. And I want to apologize to you for acting the way I did to your first question and cutting you off. Maybe had some sensitivity from some of the battles we went through up there, and I apologize for that. I don't really know the answer precisely you're asking. I think it's going to be more a topic of future community discussions about I think the developer that if you guys go through a process of work with can answer questions like that. I would think there may be an opportunity to do some kind of mix on a project of this size. Maybe have some number of the homes be serving, the households that are most in need and access, both the state and federal, as well as, maybe local funds to make that possible. I sense from the way this project is being talked about that there is a kind of market viable project. If you have CHIP in place, if the public infrastructure is paid for, that there is a project that can pay its own way that could be successful. I think that's why there's energy and effort going in to move this forward, is there is an economically viable project there. But I haven't reviewed the numbers. I haven't assessed that for you guys. I think that's what you guys are going to get into that future discussions.
Okay. I'm reading the room here. Maybe one last little bit of a question from Zoom, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. A question about the impact, and the growth and the social infrastructure, and whether or not that can provide, service to the people that might come in. I think the context of what we're hearing and learning is the schools are, school enrollment's down generally. We're talking about merging and closing schools. We're talking about healthcare costs that are expensive because there's a limited number of customers that are insured. I think those are some of the context, but that's, one of the questions that's going to have to get answered during this process is, the growth that does happen. How does that relate to the growth rate of the community, and how does the community, the market absorb those units, and how does that all work? So it's definitely a question that